Hi, this is Michael, your storyteller. Welcome to our channel Frightening Tales. Crime story in a haunted house. Opening scene, eerie music, low thunder rumbling. Narrator, calm yet ominous tone. There are crimes that defy explanation. Murders with no suspects. Vanished victims with no trace. And then, there are cases that lead detectives to places they were never meant to go. This is one of those stories. Sound of a car driving through a gravel road. It was a cold autumn night when Detective James Carter arrived at the infamous Blackwood Manor. The house stood like a relic from another time, tall, decayed, forgotten. Its windows were like empty eyes, watching as he stepped out of his car. The call had come just after midnight. A desperate voice on the other end, barely a whisper. "Help me, before it's too late." But when Carter traced the call, he found something disturbing. The number belonged to Olivia Reynolds, a woman who had been missing for 30 years. Sound of wind howling, a distant door creaking. He wasn't superstitious. He didn't believe in ghosts. But when he crossed the threshold of the abandoned mansion, the air itself seemed to tighten around him. The temperature dropped. His breath became visible. And then, the door slammed shut behind him. Sudden loud bang, heartbeat sound effect. His flashlight flickered as he moved through the grand, decayed hallway. The place smelled of damp wood and something else, something metallic. Blood. In the main hall, dust-covered furniture sat undisturbed, except for one thing, a fresh trail of footprints leading upstairs. But Carter wasn't alone. Distant whispers, a child's laughter echoing. He reached for his gun, but an invisible force seemed to weigh down his arm. The whispers turned into distorted voices, a chorus of overlapping cries. And then, he saw it. A shadowy figure standing at the top of the stairs. Not moving. Just watching. Sound of static interference, the figure suddenly vanishes. As he climbed the stairs, the wooden steps groaned beneath him. Every door in the hallway was sealed shut except for one. The master bedroom. Inside, the furniture was untouched, covered in white sheets. But in the center of the room stood something that sent ice through his veins. A rocking chair, rocking by itself. And next to it, a phone, its cord cut. The same phone Olivia Reynolds had used to call him. Loud ringing sound and silence. Then, in the reflection of the dusty mirror, Carter saw something move behind him. Not a shadow. Not a trick of the light. Something real. Something waiting. He turned, gun drawn. And then, the floor beneath him caved in. Sound of wood breaking, a sudden scream, then darkness. The next morning, his car was found outside Blackwood Manor. The front door was open. But of Detective Carter, there was no sign. Except for the phone, sitting in the hallway. And when the officer picked it up, a voice on the other end whispered, "Help me, before it's too late." Static interference cut to black. Static noise, distorted whispers, a ticking clock in the background. Detective James Carter was never seen again after entering Blackwood Manor. His car remained untouched. His belongings, intact. But his body, gone. The only clue left behind was a phone with a disconnected cord still warm to the touch. But this is not where the story ends. Because the next night, another call was made. This time, to Detective Sarah Mitchell. Phone ringing. A deep breath before answering. Sarah, hesitant. Detective Mitchell. Distorted whisper on the other end. "Help me." Sarah froze. The voice was Carter's. Sound of a clock striking midnight. She replayed the recording a dozen times. The timestamp was impossible. The call came from Carter's own phone. But he was missing. Dead, or worse. Sound of car engine starting. Tires screeching on gravel. Determined to find him, Sarah drove to Blackwood Manor, armed and ready. But when she arrived, the house wasn't abandoned anymore. The front door was open. Inside, the grand hallway looked different. The dust was gone. The furniture, arranged as if someone had just been there. A fireplace crackled with fresh embers, and the scent of burning wood mixed with something rotten. And then she saw them. Footprints. Leading down, instead of up. They vanished at the basement door. Sound of an old wooden door creaking open. The basement was unnaturally cold, swallowing her flashlight beam like a black hole. A single, swinging light bulb cast erratic shadows on the walls. And then, she saw it. A chair in the center of the room, with handcuffs attached to the arms. And something worse. Blood. Fresh. Smearing the floor in a pattern. A circle. With strange symbols. Sarah's heartbeat pounded. She took a step closer, and that's when she noticed. The walls were breathing. The old wooden planks expanded and contracted as if the house itself was alive. A low, wheezing sound filled the room. And then, the chair moved. Not from the wind. Something was in it. She lifted her flashlight, and her stomach twisted. Detective Carter. Or, what was left of him. His eyes were open but lifeless, his face twisted in an expression of pure horror. His mouth moved, forming silent words. And then, his head snapped toward her. Distorted voice, overlapping with whispers. Sarah, you shouldn't have come. Loud static, the walls crack. A hand grabbed her ankle. But it wasn't Carter. It was something else. Something behind him. Something that wasn't human. Sarah screams. Cut to black. Detective Sarah Mitchell went into Blackwood Manor looking for James Carter. She found him. But she also found something else. Something that shouldn't exist. Something waiting. Heavy breathing. The sound of a heartbeat increasing. She wanted to run, but her feet refused to move. Carter's body sat rigid in the chair, his mouth moving without sound, his dead eyes locked onto hers. But it wasn't Carter anymore. Distorted overlapping voices, whispering in her ear. He let us in, now you will too. Sudden, sharp ringing noise. Sarah clutches her head. The walls pulsed, the air thick like molasses. And then Carter stood up. But his movements were wrong. Like a marionette on broken strings. Sarah's gun trembled in her hands. Sarah, shaking. James. Carter, grinning, voice overlapping with a deeper one. James is gone. Sound of glass shattering. Light flickers violently. She blinked, and suddenly he was behind her. A cold breath on her neck. A hand on her shoulder. She spun around, gun raised, but Carter was gone. And she was no longer in the basement. She stood in a long hallway. The same hallway. But the walls were lined with mirrors. Each reflection was wrong. Some showed her, but not quite. A version of her without eyes. A version of her laughing with blood dripping from her mouth. A version of her screaming, pounding on the glass from the inside. And then one mirror caught her breath. Because it didn't show her at all. It showed Carter. Standing at the end of the hallway, holding a knife dripping with blood. Sarah's chest tightened. She turned around. And tripped over a body. A fresh corpse. Lifeless eyes stared back at her. It was Detective Carter. But that was impossible. He had just been standing. A hand wrapped around her wrist. The dead Carter's hand. His mouth moved, whispering in her ear, but she couldn't hear it. The static in her mind was too loud. Then she saw it. Her own reflection in the mirror. Except, she was holding the knife. Her hands were covered in blood. Sarah, whispering, confused, No, no, I didn't. But the mirrors didn't lie. She had killed him. Hadn't she? Distant child's laughter, distorted voices echoing in the mirrors. The walls cracked. The ground lurched beneath her. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, suffocating her thoughts. And then, silence. A phone rang in the distance. The same phone. The disconnected one. And her voice whispered from the darkness. Help me, before it's too late. Calm, unnerving tone. Time doesn't work the same inside Blackwood Manor. It loops. It stretches. It rewrites itself. Sarah Mitchell stood frozen, staring at the knife in her hands. The blood felt warm. Fresh. Real. Detective James Carter's lifeless body lay at her feet. But Carter was also, in the mirror. Watching. Smiling. And then, without warning, the corpse spoke. Carter, gurgling, voice layered with whispers. You remember now, don't you? Sarah staggered back, shaking her head. Sarah, whispering, panicked. No, no, this isn't real. She turned to the mirror, desperate for an answer, but her reflection was gone. Instead, the glass showed a door. A door that didn't exist in the hallway behind her. A door painted in something dark, something thick, something that smelled like blood. And then it creaked open. A low, guttural breathing sound fills the air. A long, dark corridor stretched beyond the frame of the mirror. It wasn't a reflection anymore. It was a passage. And something was waiting inside. Sarah's breath hitched. The body at her feet twitched. Carter's corpse turned its head toward the mirror. Carter, grinning, whispering. They're waiting for you. Sudden static blast, the mirror shatters. Sarah stumbles backward. Darkness. And then she was somewhere else. Not the house. Not the hallway. A small, white room. No windows. No doors. Just a single chair and a flickering overhead light. And across from her a man she recognized. Detective Carter. Alive. Untouched. Smirking. Sarah blinked. The blood on her hands was gone. The mirrors, the corpse, the whispers all gone. She gasped for breath, clutching her head. Sarah. What is this? Carter leaned forward, tapping the table between them. His expression calm. Controlled. Carter, softly. You tell me. And then, he slid something across the table. A case file. The name on it sent ice through her veins. Case number 327, Detective Sarah Mitchell. Her own case. Her own murder investigation. Sarah's pulse pounded. She flipped open the file, hands trembling, and saw a crime scene photo. A body, in a chair. Her body. Dead. Sarah, whispering, horrified. No, no, that's not. She looked up, desperate for an explanation, but Carter was gone. The room was gone. She was back in the house. And the whispers were laughing. Somewhere, the phone rang again. And this time, she knew who was calling. Low, controlled tone. Sarah Mitchell wasn't sure what was real anymore. She wasn't even sure if she was Sarah Mitchell. The case file in her trembling hands told a different story. Case number 327, Detective Sarah Mitchell. Her own name. Her own case. And inside it, a crime scene photo, her own lifeless body slumped in a chair. But she was here, wasn't she? Alive. Breathing. Wasn't she? A clock chimes. The sound is distant, distorted, like a memory unraveling. Sarah shut her eyes. Breathe. Think. Piece it together. She had followed Carter into Blackwood Manor. She had found his body. Or thought she had. And now she was sitting in a room that shouldn't exist, staring at a case file that shouldn't exist, with Carter watching her from across the table. Except now, he was gone. The chair he had been sitting in rocked slightly, as if someone had just gotten up. But the door was still shut. No footsteps. No sound. Nothing but the ticking of an unseen clock. Sarah swallowed, her throat dry. She needed out. Now. She pushed herself up from the chair, her legs weak beneath her. The file slid from her lap, spilling onto the floor. More pictures. More evidence. Her breath hitched as her eyes scanned the pages. Crime scene notes. Victim, Detective Sarah Mitchell. Cause of death, exsanguination due to multiple lacerations. Time of death, 2:17 a.m. Witnesses, N/A. Suspect, S unknown. Handwritten note in the margins. She kept repeating the same thing before she died. It's not me. It's not me. It's not me. Sarah's fingers curled against the page. No. No, this was a trick. Some sick joke. She wasn't dead. She wasn't. Sarah. A voice. Right behind her. She turned sharply. Nothing. Just the empty chair. Just the flickering light. Just the suffocating silence that stretched longer and longer each second. Then. A shadow moved. Not hers. Something else. The walls of the room twitched. And the mirror that hadn't been there before, began to crack. The mirror shatters. Sarah is sucked into another version of Blackwood Manor, but in this one, time is distorted. She finds evidence that she has been here before. Over and over again. The shifting reality, rooms change, mirrors reflect events that haven't happened yet, and Sarah starts hearing her own voice before she speaks. She is no longer sure if she is making choices or if the house is forcing them on her. The murder that never happened, or did it? Sarah discovers a fresh murder scene, but the victim is her. Again. Someone or something is hunting different versions of her in different timelines. Carter's role. Carter isn't just a victim. He has been playing a game with the house, and Sarah was always part of it. But was he ever real? Or is he just another part of the house? The ritual of Blackwood Manor. Sarah uncovers evidence that Blackwood Manor is not just haunted, it is alive. It feeds on repetition. On choices. On mistakes. And worst of all, she was never the first detective to be trapped here. The identity crisis. Sarah sees herself in other roles. Sometimes she is the detective, sometimes she is the victim, sometimes she is the killer. The house is breaking her sense of self. The phone calls become clearer, the whispers she's been hearing belong to her past selves. Each time she failed to escape, a new Sarah was born. Each time she died, she became part of the house. A new murder happens. Just when Sarah believes she's found a way out, another detective arrives at the manor. The cycle begins again. But this time, she isn't the victim. The sound of glass shattering. The mirror explodes outward, sending shards flying into the room. But the shards don't hit the floor. They freeze suspended in mid-air, reflecting 100 different versions of Sarah's face, each one distorted, twisted in agony. Narrator. Haunted. Unsteady tone. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive. And it was watching her. Sarah staggered back, her breath catching as the frozen shards began to turn slowly until every reflection was staring directly at her. Some faces were crying. Some were smiling. Some were screaming. And then, in one shard, a reflection moved on its own. Sarah's reflection, whispering, "It's not me." Sarah gasped. The shard shot forward. She raised her arms, instinctively trying to protect herself, but instead of hitting her, it embedded itself in her shadow. A sudden rush of cold. A sharp, electric shock running through her body. Her vision fractured. Reality split. And suddenly she was somewhere else. The red room. Sarah stumbled forward, gasping for air. She wasn't in the interrogation room anymore. The shattered mirror, the case file, the flickering light all gone. Instead, she stood in a small, windowless room bathed in deep red light. The walls pulsed like they were breathing. The floor was slick beneath her shoes. She looked down and... blood. Not fresh. Dark. Sticky. Old. And in the center of the room a chair. The same chair from the crime scene photos. The same chair where her body had been found. And someone was sitting in it. Herself. Dead. Motionless. Eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. A deep, gaping wound carved across her throat. Her lips still slightly parted, as if she had been trying to say something before she died. Sarah's hands began to shake. Her mind screamed, this isn't real, but she had no proof of that anymore. A whisper. Right behind her. Voice, soft, familiar, she's not the first. Sarah spun around. And saw herself. A different version of her. This Sarah was older. Paler. Wearing an old, blood-stained detective badge. Her eyes were hollow, dark pits, as if all life had been drained from them. Old Sarah, softly, and she won't be the last. A deafening thud shakes the room. The walls begin to bleed. Sarah stumbled back. The chair creaked. The dead version of herself twitched. And then, it grabbed her wrist. The house is breaking Sarah's reality even further. The different versions of herself are now appearing physically, not just in reflections. She is starting to realize. There have been many Sarahs before her. Each one has lived through this cycle, each one has failed to escape. Some versions of her turned into something else. The house doesn't just kill, it keeps pieces of its victims. Some Sarahs are trapped in walls. Some whisper through the phone. Some haunt the next Sarah. The murder was never just one event. Sarah finds evidence of multiple deaths, each identical, stretching across decades. But the handwriting in the case files? It's hers. Carter's true role is revealed. He wasn't just a detective, he was a previous victim, one who made a deal with the house. And Sarah might be forced to make one too. The house demands a sacrifice. One version of Sarah has to die for another to live. But if she kills her past self, what does that make her? The grip on Sarah's wrist tightens. The dead version of herself, cold, unmoving, lifeless, now clings to her with an unnatural force. Narrator, shaky, breathless. Sarah tried to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. Her throat clenched. The air felt too thick, as if the house itself had pressed in on her lungs. Her dead doppelganger's lips twitched. Then moved. A whisper. Dead Sarah, let me in. The grip tightened further. Flesh cracked under its own pressure. Her wrists started to split. Sarah yanked herself free. She stumbled backward, panting, her skin still tingling where the corpse had touched her. Her head throbbed as the walls pulsed as if they had veins, as if the house was breathing. And then, from the shadows, came the laugh. Low. Amused. Familiar. Carter. The house is speaking now. Carter stepped forward, but he wasn't Carter anymore. His eyes were wrong black voids, swallowing everything around them. His mouth twisted into a grin too wide, his teeth too sharp. Carter, you're close now. Sarah's pulse pounded. Close to what? She had no idea what he meant, but every part of her screamed to run. But the house, it wouldn't let her. The walls tightened, the red light deepened, and from the edges of the room, whispers rose like 100 voices breathing in unison. The whispers, let her remember. Sarah staggered. Her vision blurred. Her thoughts were no longer her own. And then she saw. The truth buried in time. Flashes of memories not hers, but hers. 1923, a woman, dressed in detective's garb, bleeding out on the same chair Sarah had seen before. Her hands clutching her throat. Her last words: "It's not me." 1956, another woman, same uniform, same eyes. Her head snapped at an unnatural angle. The house swallowing her shadow as she screamed. 1989, a woman with her face Sarah's face standing at the top of the grand staircase, a gun in her hand, whispering to herself, "One of us has to die." The cycle wasn't days, weeks, or years. It was centuries. Every version of Sarah had been here before. Every single one had died. And the house it kept them. Their echoes. Their pain. Their fear. And now, it wanted her to choose. The choice. Carter stepped closer. The walls shrank in. The air grew colder. "Carter, you're going to do it differently this time, aren't you?" His voice was sweet. Mocking. Sarah's hands trembled. Her own past self stared at her from the cracked mirror shards, waiting. Watching. Would she be the first to survive? Or just another echo? And then, a cold realization sank in. The house didn't want to kill her. It wanted her to become something else. The descent into madness. Sarah's mind spirals. Her perception of time begins to fracture. She sees multiple versions of herself in different timelines, all making different choices. One Sarah runs, only to find herself right back where she started. One Sarah attacks Carter, only for his face to twist into something inhuman. One Sarah surrenders to the house, letting it swallow her whole. Which one is real? Which one is her? As the walls begin to close in, Carter leans in, his voice barely a whisper. "Carter, choose." And Sarah? She finally understands. She was never meant to leave. Darkness. A breath ragged, uneven. Sarah tries to move, but the world around her resists. It's not just the air that's thick now. It's reality itself. There was no way out. Not really. Not when every door led back to the same room. Not when time bent in on itself like a looped thread pulling tighter with every step she took. Sarah was starting to forget. Not just where she was but who. Identity unraveling. The walls of Blackwood Manor shifted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Doors appeared where there were none. Staircases led upward for hours, only to end up right where they started. And the mirrors. They were the worst of all. Sarah's reflection moved before she did now. Sometimes, it watched her. Sometimes, it spoke. Reflection: "Sarah, if you keep going, you won't like what you find." Sarah reached up, pressing her palm to the cold glass. The version of herself staring back didn't mirror the motion. It only smiled. She yanked her hand away. No. No, this wasn't real. She had to hold on to something. Something true. She fumbled for her badge, gripping it like an anchor. But the name engraved on it. Detective Claire Holloway. Sarah's stomach lurched. That wasn't her name. Was it? The house is tearing her apart. She tried to retrace her steps, but the more she walked, the more she felt disconnected. Her own thoughts began to overlap, doubling, tripling. Voices that weren't hers whispered over her shoulder. Each time she looked at her hands, they seemed less real. The flesh flickered, like static on a broken television screen. She wasn't just trapped in the house. She was dissolving into it. The shadow of herself. In the center of the manor stood a grand hallway, stretching impossibly long, lined with portraits. The frames were ornate, gilded. But the faces inside them. All of them were Sarah. Each one different. Some older. Some younger. Some with bullet wounds in their heads. some with wide, unblinking eyes, as if caught in the moment of their own death. Sarah walked past them, heart pounding, until one of them blinked. She stopped. "Portrait Sarah, softly, you can't fight it?" Sarah staggered back. The portraits began to shift. Faces morphing, twisting, distorting. Until suddenly, the Sarah inside the portrait was standing right behind her. She turned sharply, heart pounding, but there was no one there. Just a whisper, curling around her ear like a breath. "There was never just one of us." The lie of reality. Sarah's hands trembled. She needed to find something real. Something concrete. But as she reached into her pocket, pulling out the case file she'd been carrying since she got here, the name on it had changed again. Victim, Carter Reynolds. Her breath hitched. That was impossible. Carter wasn't the victim. He was the one leading her deeper into this nightmare. She flipped to the crime scene photo and her own dead body stared back at her. This wasn't Carter's file. It was hers. The madness consumes. Sarah clutched the file to her chest, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She needed to remember. She needed to hold on. But the house whispered otherwise. The house wanted her to let go. And the worst part was, she was starting to want that too. The sound of pages turning. Soft at first, then frantic. Sarah sits in the middle of a dimly lit study, surrounded by endless case files. Each one bears the same name, hers. Sarah flipped through the files, her hands trembling. Every case, every body, every single victim, was her. Hundreds of her. Thousands. Some were shot. Some were strangled. Some had no faces at all. And yet, every entry read the same. Subject, Sarah Holloway. Status, unresolved. The study of the forgotten. The walls of the study shifted, lined with bookshelves stretching into the abyss. The books held no titles, only dates. And when Sarah reached for one, the cover split open like a breathing wound. Inside, a memory she didn't recognize. A Sarah from another time, another cycle. One who had fought harder. One who had almost escaped. And then, a hand closed around her wrist. The other Sarah. Sarah whipped around, but no one was there. The cold imprint of fingers lingered on her skin. The house wasn't just showing her things anymore. It was touching her. Holding her in place. And then she saw it. The door. At the far end of the study, just beyond the last bookshelf, a door she swore hadn't been there before. Faint light seeped through its cracks, and from the other side, a voice called out. Sarah's voice, "You have to listen. You have to remember." Sarah's breath hitched. The voice wasn't coming from behind the door. It was coming from inside her own head. The truth that shouldn't exist. Her pulse hammered as she stepped forward. The door was locked. But her hands were already turning the knob. The room beyond was not a room. It was a reflection. A mirror image of the study, but this one was decayed. Dust choked. Smelling of rot. The books were torn open, their pages blank. The desk in the center was overturned, and in its shadow, a woman. No, not just any woman. Herself. But older. Weaker. Hollow-eyed. She was curled against the desk, arms wrapped around her knees. She didn't move. Didn't even breathe. And then, her lips moved. Older Sarah, hoarse whisper, "You've been here before." The cycle revealed. The walls shuddered. The bookshelves trembled, their spines splitting open as if screaming. Sarah staggered back, but the older version of herself lifted her head. Older Sarah, "You think you're solving this mystery?" A long, terrible pause. "You're not." Sarah's breath came fast, ragged. The house groaned, shifting around her. She had to get out. She turned for the door. But there was no door anymore. Only Carter. Standing in the empty frame, smiling. "Carter, softly, you're almost ready." The breakdown. The whispers grew louder. The files piled higher. Her own voice echoed from unseen places. The house was not haunted. The house was not cursed. The house was her. And she was breaking apart. A heartbeat. Slow. Thunderous. Sarah stands frozen, staring at Carter's eerie smile. But something is off. The room around them flickers. The bookshelves tremble. The files dissolve into static like a glitch in reality itself. The house was breaking. Or maybe she was. And Carter wasn't supposed to be here. The simulation fractures. Carter took a step forward, and the world rippled. A distortion. A malfunction. His face flickered, his eyes hollow 1 second, burning the next. Like an image struggling to hold itself together. Sarah gasped, stumbling back, her breath ragged. She looked at her hands. They were pixelated. Glitching. Unraveling into thin, flickering lines of data. The house wasn't haunted. It wasn't even real. Sarah is not who she thinks she is. She turned wildly, reaching for anything solid. The desk. The bookshelf. But as soon as her fingers brushed against them, they distorted. Warped. A blank, white void. Silent. Empty. Then breathing. Rapid, uneven. Sarah awakens, but there is no floor beneath her, no walls around her. Only an infinite nothingness stretching in all directions. Narrator, disoriented, desperate. There was no more house. No more Carter. No more reality. Only absence. The void between worlds. Sarah clutched her head, gasping. She was still here. But where was here? Her fingers brushed against something solid. No. Not solid. Familiar. A piece of paper materialized in her hands, text burning across its surface. Project Holloway. System failure imminent. Attempting reconstruction. Her pulse spiked. They were trying to reset her. She had to move. Had to think. Had to. The phantom code. A whisper. Not hers. Not Carter's. Unknown voice, "Sarah, you're not alone." She whipped around, but the void offered no form, no presence, only the static of something unseen. The whisper continued. "You were never the only one." Her skin crawled. Was someone else trapped here? The air rippled, a glitch tearing through the nothingness. And suddenly, the room that shouldn't exist. Walls snapped into place around her. A room, flickering between existence and erasure. A chair. A desk. A single, humming monitor. And on the screen, a live feed. Her breath caught. It was her. Not in this room. Not in the void. Somewhere else. Another version of herself trapped. Monitored. Studied. Her fingers twitched, hovering over the keyboard. The screen blinked, and a message appeared. "Would you like to connect?" A pause. The void around her pulsed, a warning. But Sarah wasn't the same person she had been before. Her lips parted. And she whispered, "Yes." Carter's smile widened. He wasn't breaking. Only she was. "Carter, softly, you weren't supposed to wake up." Sarah's vision flickered. Her breath hitched. Memories once she didn't recognize flooded in. Another life. Another version of herself. The experiment. The files. The endless deaths. The shifting reality. It wasn't a haunting. It was a loop. A simulation. She wasn't solving a crime, she was the crime. Her body trembled as the files reappeared, no longer case reports but data logs. The words changed before her eyes. Project Holloway. Subject hashtag 047. Cycle 92. Outcome, unstable. Reset pending. The walls pulsed. The floor cracked apart beneath her feet. She wasn't real. She was a construct. A test subject. And the test was failing. Carter's true role. Carter stepped forward, his form now smooth, polished perfect. No longer the man she thought she knew, but something else entirely. An observer. A controller. Sarah's breath came in sharp, panicked bursts. "No," she whispered. "No, this isn't." Carter reached out, his fingers brushing her temple. And suddenly, the entire world froze. The final revelation. A voice not Carter's echoed from above, metallic and cold. System compromised. Manual termination initiated. Sarah screamed as the walls of the house began to vanish. Not crumble. Not burn. Just delete. Her reflection in the shattered mirror looked back one last time, whispering, "Wake up." And then, everything turned white. There was no more house. No more Carter. No more reality. Only absence. The void between worlds. Sarah clutched her head, gasping. She was still here. But where was here? Her fingers brushed against something solid. No. Not solid. Familiar. A piece of paper materialized in her hands, text burning across its surface. Project Holloway. System failure imminent. Attempting reconstruction. Her pulse spiked. They were trying to reset her. She had to move. Had to think. Had to. The phantom code. A whisper. Not hers. Not Carter's. Unknown voice, "Sarah, you're not alone." She whipped around, but the void offered no form, no presence, only the static of something unseen. The whisper continued. "You were never the only one." Her skin crawled. Was someone else trapped here? The air rippled, a glitch tearing through the nothingness. And suddenly, the room that shouldn't exist. Walls snapped into place around her. A room, flickering between existence and erasure. A chair. A desk. A single, humming monitor. And on the screen, a live feed. Her breath caught. It was her. Not in this room. Not in the void. Somewhere else. Another version of herself trapped. Monitored. Studied. Her fingers twitched, hovering over the keyboard. The screen blinked, and a message appeared. "Would you like to connect?" A pause. The void around her pulsed, a warning. But Sarah wasn't the same person she had been before. Her lips parted. And she whispered, "Yes." She was slipping. Splintering. Tearing into something new. The versions of Sarah. Sarah hit the ground with a sharp gasp, except it wasn't a ground at all. It was a body. Hers. But not her. She scrambled back, choking on panic. The woman beneath her, another Sarah, lay sprawled on a cold laboratory floor, eyes vacant, mouth frozen in a silent scream. Wires ran from her temples, disappearing into the ceiling. Sarah turned wildly. More bodies. Rows of them. All her. Some still breathing. Some not. And at the far end of the room a door creaked open. The observer revealed. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the dim, sterile light. Not Carter. But someone worse. Someone identical to her. Her own face. But older. Tired. Hollow-eyed. watching her with cold calculation. Older Sarah, you finally made it? Sarah's pulse thundered. Who are you? Older Sarah, the first. A silence stretched between them, heavy with knowing. Then older Sarah's voice dropped, a whisper of finality. You're not supposed to exist. The erasure begins. The overhead lights flickered, alarms wailed, and the bodies in the room started to dissolve. The walls shifted, code unraveling, revealing glimpses of other realities bleeding through. A hospital. A prison cell. A burning house. Sarah clutched her head, the world glitching apart. She had seen horror before. But this was different. This was everything unraveling at once. And older Sarah just stood there, smiling. Older Sarah, you should have never connected. Sarah stumbled back, but the void reached for her, code collapsing, bodies erasing, entire versions of herself deleted in real time. She had seconds before she disappeared too. Unless. Her gaze snapped to the control panel on the wall, flickering like a dying heartbeat. A single prompt remained on the screen. Override system. Her fingers hovered over the keys. She had one choice. And no way of knowing what would happen if she pressed enter. She had seconds. Erase or be erased. But was she deleting the system or herself? The last key press. She slammed the enter key. A scream ripped through the void. The world shuddered. Collapsed. But Sarah remained. The laboratory disintegrated around her, bodies of her past selves blinking out of existence. Older Sarah's expression twisted, not in fear, not in rage, but in something far worse. Approval. Older Sarah, smiling, now you understand. Sarah's breath came in short gasps. The system was shutting down, but she was still standing. Still real. Had she won? The answer came instantly. No. The other side of deletion. The void didn't claim her. Something else did. A door materialized where nothing should exist. Massive. Ancient. Waiting. A deep, crawling voice slithered through the remaining static. You are awake, but you are not free. The door swung open on its own. And beyond it? A city. Not a modern one. A rotting, impossible city built from the ruins of 1,000 other existences. Towers stretched at unnatural angles. Streets twisted into paradoxes. And figures moved within it. Watching. Waiting. This wasn't the world she came from. This was what lay beneath. And it had been waiting for her. Sarah is not alone. Footsteps echoed behind her. She turned. Carter. But not her Carter. His face was stretched, shifting through versions of himself. The detective. The corpse. The smiling observer. And something else entirely. Carter, softly, in overlapping voices, you should not have come here. Sarah's hands clenched. Where am I? Carter tilted his head. Carter, the only place left when the system fails. She turned back to the city. The shadows moved. Twitched. Twisted. They weren't just people. They were the erased. And they were waiting for her to join them. Sarah took a step forward. She had come too far to stop now. She was going to find out the truth. Even if it meant there was no way back. Sarah had spent so long trying to escape the system. She had never stopped to ask what lay beneath it. The path of the forgotten. Sarah stepped forward, and the city responded. Buildings shifted, growing taller, leaning toward her. The air hummed, thick with something unspeakable. The erased were aware of her now. Carter moved ahead, his body flickering, torn between forms, between lives. Every version of him was here, trapped inside himself. Carter, you need to understand, Sarah. This isn't a place. It's a consequence. Her skin crawled. A consequence of what? Carter's head twitched. The echoes in his voice deepened. Carter, of failing the experiment. The architect's mark. Sarah's pulse spiked. The experiment. Project Holloway. It hadn't just been a simulation. It had been a test. And everyone who failed ended up here. A sudden whisper slithered through the air, different from Carter's voice. Ancient. Calculating. She has come too far. Sarah spun toward the source. A figure stood in the center of the warped street. Tall. Unmoving. A featureless face, only its eyes visible hollow voids, absorbing everything. The architect. Carter tensed beside her, his body flickering in violent glitches. The architect, you were meant to be erased. Sarah's hands clenched. Then why am I still here? The architect's head tilted. The city trembled. The erased moved closer. The architect, because you are unfinished. The final choice. The city fractured. The streets began to peel away, revealing an abyss beneath a writhing darkness that pulsed with trapped souls. Sarah's body burned. Her skin cracked, glitching at the edges. She was becoming part of it. Carter reached for her, his fingers phasing between human and something else entirely. Carter, urgent, breaking apart. Sarah, listen to me. There's still a way out. The architect raised a hand. Carter collapsed, his body dissolving into static, dragged toward the abyss. Sarah screamed. But she had no time to mourn. The architect's voice echoed in her skull. Choose, Sarah. Before her, two paths appeared. Step forward and become part of the erased, lost forever, but never suffering again. Run and fight for a chance at truth, but risk being hunted by something even worse. Her breath hitched. She had seconds to decide. Sarah clenched her fists. She was not done yet. And whatever happened next, she would not go quietly. The city groans as if it's alive. The erased figures shift closer, silent, waiting. The abyss beneath Sarah churns, whispering secrets she cannot understand. The architect watches, its hollow gaze locked onto her. Narrator, trapped, unraveling. There was no right choice. No safe path. Only consequences. The divergence. Sarah did not step forward. She did not run. She did something worse. She hesitated. The city reacted instantly. The erased figures surged toward her. Their forms were shifting, stretching, turning into reflections of her own face. Every failed version of herself lunging for her throat. Carter had warned her. She had waited too long. Carter, a flickering echo, lost in static. Sarah moved. But Carter was gone. There was only her. And them. The pain of knowing. Sarah fought. She clawed, kicked, screamed, but every erased she tore apart only reassembled into something worse. Each time she struck, their mouths widened, whispering fragments of her own memories. Erased Sarah number 1, you shouldn't have trusted him. Erased Sarah number 2, you let him die. Erased Sarah number 3, you've always been the villain. Their voices tangled together, growing louder, deafening. Sarah fell to her knees, hands clamped over her ears, but the memories bled through. The lab. The simulations. The trials she had forgotten. And at the center of it all, the architect's hand, guiding her every failure. The architect's truth. The shadows peeled apart, and suddenly she was no longer in the city. She was in a sterile white room. Cold. Empty. Familiar. A single metal chair sat in the center, and on it, herself. But this Sarah was strapped down. Tubes ran from her veins to a humming machine. Electrodes dotted her scalp, feeding signals into the system. This was the real world. She was seeing herself outside of the experiment. The architect's voice slithered from the ceiling. The architect, you were never supposed to wake up. Sarah's breath hitched. The experiment wasn't just a test. It was a prison. And she was the only prisoner. A way out, a way down. The chair-bound Sarah opened her eyes. And she smiled. Sarah recoiled. No. That wasn't possible. She was strapped down. Trapped. But then she realized. She wasn't the one looking in. She was the one on the outside. And something else was in her body. The machine whined. The architect stepped closer, its hollow gaze narrowing. The architect, you cannot undo what has already begun. The chair-bound Sarah tilted her head, grinning wider. Strapped Sarah, you should have taken the first option. The room exploded into darkness. And Sarah fell. She did not stop falling. She did not wake up. Because there was no waking up anymore. Falling should have felt like something. But it didn't. There was no wind, no weight, no end. Only descent. The hollow self. Sarah's mind splintered as she fell. Memories blurred, bleeding into one another, twisting into something unrecognizable. Her name, was it even Sarah anymore? Images flashed. The lab metal restraints, white coats, an experiment running too long. Carter's voice pleading, warning, then, silence. The architect watching, calculating, rewriting reality around her. The other Sarah still strapped to that chair, still smiling. Was she dreaming? Was she still in the simulation, or had she become something worse? The whispering grew louder, forming words that coiled around her like chains. Who are you now? Sarah opened her mouth to answer. But someone else spoke first. The thing wearing her face. Sarah slammed into the ground, except there was no ground. She simply stopped falling. And suddenly, she was standing in her old apartment. The couch, the coffee table, the books she had never finished reading. Except, a woman was already there. Sitting at the kitchen counter, stirring a cup of coffee. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The woman was her. Same face. Same eyes. Same voice when she finally spoke. Other Sarah, you're late. Sarah staggered back. No. No, this isn't real. The other Sarah sipped her coffee. You've been saying that a lot. The walls of the apartment rippled. The bookshelves sagged, the paintings melted into static. The coffee in other Sarah's cup turned black as oil. Sarah clenched her fists. Who are you? The other Sarah finally smiled. And it was the exact same smile the strapped Sarah had given her before the darkness took her. Other Sarah, I'm the part of you that listened. The architect's last lie. Sarah lunged. But her body froze mid-motion. Not by force. Not by pain. By knowledge. The moment she moved, she remembered everything. The truth came rushing back, flooding her mind in pieces. The experiment was never about survival. The architect was never controlling her. She had been controlling herself. The city. The erased. The horror. Every nightmare had been of her own design. Sarah's knees buckled. No, that's not. I didn't. The other Sarah rose from the counter, stepping closer. Other Sarah, you knew. You always knew. Sarah backed away. No. No, the architect. Other Sarah, was never real. Sarah shook her head violently. It spoke to me. It hunted me. The other Sarah tilted her head. Mocking. Understanding. Other Sarah, did it? Or did you make it? A sound slithered through the apartment, laughter. Familiar. Terrifying. Her own. Sarah clamped her hands over her ears. But she could still hear it. Because it was coming from inside her. The final door. The apartment door stood behind other Sarah. A door that had never been there before. Sarah felt its pull. A way out. A way in. Other Sarah stepped aside, gesturing toward it. If you really want to know, open it. Sarah hesitated. And if I don't? The other Sarah's grin widened, stretching too far. Too many teeth. Too many secrets. Other Sarah, then we stay here. Forever. Sarah's hand trembled on the doorknob. Somewhere in the distance, something knocked from the other side. She took a deep breath and turned the handle. Sarah stepped through, and the world changed again. The door clicks open. Sarah steps through. A breath, a shift, and then silence. She is somewhere new. Somewhere worse. Narrator, unraveling, lost. What was I before this moment? A person? A memory, or just another echo of something that never existed? The corridor of echoes. Sarah's foot touched the ground, and the world sighed. The apartment was gone. The other Sarah was gone. In their place stretched a long, endless corridor. Its walls pulsed as if breathing. They were covered in something fleshy, damp. The air was thick with the scent of something metallic, blood, but not fresh. She turned back, but there was no door behind her. No way back. A whisper slid along her spine. Whisper, keep walking. Sarah swallowed hard. She walked. The faces in the walls. At first, the corridor was empty. Just the sound of her footsteps. Just the air pressing against her skin. Then, a face pushed out from the wall beside her. Not a painting. Not a memory. A real face, trapped beneath the skin of the corridor. Its mouth opened in a silent scream. Sarah lurched away, heart pounding. But as she moved forward, more faces emerged. Carter. Dr. Holloway. Her mother. Her own face, a dozen times over. Each one whispered as she passed. You did this. You let us die. This is the price. Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. No, she whispered back. No, I didn't. But she wasn't sure anymore. The child at the end of the hall. Sarah kept walking until the corridor ended. At the very end, standing in front of a single black door, was a child. A little girl, maybe 6 years old. Wearing Sarah's old dress. The girl looked up, and Sarah's stomach twisted. It was her. A younger version of herself. But the little girl's eyes were black holes, empty and endless. Little Sarah, you shouldn't be here. Sarah's breath shuddered. Where is here? The little girl pointed at the black door. Little Sarah, this is the last room. Sarah's hand trembled. What happens if I open it? The child didn't answer. Instead, she stepped aside. The black door pulsed. Something inside it breathed. Sarah reached for the handle. And the voices screamed. The truth that waits. Sarah's fingers brushed the door, and the world split apart. The walls peeled away, revealing something vast, something endless. A dark expanse filled with flickering memories, lives she had lived, lives she had stolen. At the center of it all was the architect. Not a man. Not a machine. Not even a god. It was her. A version of her that had become something else. The architect, Sarah's voice, but wrong. Do you finally understand? Sarah's mind fractured. The experiment had never been about her survival. It had been about how many versions of herself she was willing to kill to escape. And she had killed them all. Sarah stood at the threshold of the black door. The truth was inside. The last choice waited. Would she open it? Or had she already lost? The door clicks open. Sarah steps through. A breath, a shift, and then silence. She is somewhere new. Somewhere worse. Narrator, unraveling, lost. What was I before this moment? A person? A memory, or just another echo of something that never existed? The corridor of echoes. Sarah's foot touched the ground, and the world sighed. The apartment was gone. The other Sarah was gone. In their place stretched a long, endless corridor. Its walls pulsed as if breathing. They were covered in something fleshy, damp. The air was thick with the scent of something metallic, blood, but not fresh. She turned back, but there was no door behind her. No way back. A whisper slid along her spine. Whisper, keep walking. Sarah swallowed hard. She walked. The faces in the walls. At first, the corridor was empty. Just the sound of her footsteps. Just the air pressing against her skin. Then, a face pushed out from the wall beside her. Not a painting. Not a memory. A real face, trapped beneath the skin of the corridor. Its mouth opened in a silent scream. Sarah lurched away, heart pounding. But as she moved forward, more faces emerged. Carter. Dr. Holloway. Her mother. Her own face, a dozen times over. Each one whispered as she passed. You did this. You let us die. This is the price. Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. No, she whispered back. No, I didn't. But she wasn't sure anymore. The child at the end of the hall. Sarah kept walking until the corridor ended. At the very end, standing in front of a single black door, was a child. A little girl, maybe 6 years old. Wearing Sarah's old dress. The girl looked up, and Sarah's stomach twisted. It was her. A younger version of herself. But the little girl's eyes were black holes, empty and endless. Little Sarah, you shouldn't be here. Sarah's breath shuddered. Where is here? The little girl pointed at the black door. Little Sarah, this is the last room. Sarah's hand trembled. What happens if I open it? The child didn't answer. Instead, she stepped aside. The black door pulsed. Something inside it breathed. Sarah reached for the handle. And the voices screamed. The truth that waits. Sarah's fingers brushed the door, and the world split apart. The walls peeled away, revealing something vast, something endless. A dark expanse filled with flickering memories, lives she had lived, lives she had stolen. At the center of it all was the architect. Not a man. Not a machine. Not even a god. It was her. A version of her that had become something else. The architect, Sarah's voice, but wrong. Do you finally understand? Sarah's mind fractured. The experiment had never been about her survival. It had been about how many versions of herself she was willing to kill to escape. And she had killed them all. Sarah stood at the threshold of the black door. The truth was inside. The last choice waited. Would she open it? Or had she already lost? They told me to choose. To take my place. But what if I don't? What if I refuse? The unseen corridor. Sarah stepped forward, expecting another void, another trick. Instead, a corridor stretched before her. But unlike the flesh-bound tunnel from before, this was empty. No walls, no ceiling, just endless darkness, waiting to be filled. A single flickering bulb hung overhead, swaying despite the absence of wind. She turned back. The red door was gone. The other Sarahs were gone. Sarah was alone. Or so she thought. The watcher in the dark. She walked. The corridor stretched on. No footsteps echoed, despite her movement. Then a breath that was not hers. Sarah froze. The air behind her shuddered. She turned slowly. Something stood in the shadows. Not a person. Not quite. It had her shape. Her size. But its face. No eyes. No mouth. Just skin. It raised its hand. Mimicking her own movement. Sarah took a step back. The figure took a step forward. The bulb overhead flickered violently. Figure, you don't belong here. Sarah's throat clenched. Who are you? The figure twitched. Figure, the last one who refused. Sarah's pulse hammered. Refused what? The figure's head tilted. And then it rushed her. The fractured mirror. Sarah lunged to the side, barely dodging as the figure's fingers ripped through the air where her throat had been. She ran. But the corridor twisted, pulling her back. No escape. No end. The figure blurred, reappearing inches from her face. Sarah screamed as it grabbed her head and shoved her into the wall. The breaking point. The wall wasn't solid. It was glass. Sarah's body plunged through. She hit the ground, except it wasn't ground at all. It was water. Endless, freezing water. And in the water, below her, faces stared up. Her faces. Hundreds. Thousands. Versions of herself that had drowned before her. She tried to scream, but the water filled her lungs. She wasn't dying, she was joining them. Her reflection rippled above, grinning down at her. Her reflection, "You should have chosen the door." Darkness swallowed her whole. A single flickering light. A whisper. Something pulls her upward. The last choice. Sarah gasped as she broke the surface. The freezing water spat her out onto a marble floor. She coughed, choking on the memory of drowning. She was no longer in the corridor. No longer in the void. She was in a grand hall. The walls stretched endlessly, adorned with mirrors. But they weren't normal reflections. Each mirror held a different version of her. Some were screaming. Some were watching. One was covered in blood. One had no eyes. One had a stitched mouth that quivered as though desperate to speak. And in the center of the room, the architect stood waiting. The architect, "You should not be here." Sarah wiped water from her face. "I didn't choose this." The architect's head tilted. A smile that didn't reach its empty eyes. The architect, "But you did. Every choice led here." Sarah's breathing quickened. The mirrors hummed, vibrating with unseen energy. One by one, the versions of herself in the glass began to step forward. Sarah stumbled back. "No. No, this isn't real." The architect, "It is more real than you have ever been. The truth of the house." The walls began to bleed. The mirrors cracked. Sarah felt her mind fracture. Flashes of memory flooded in, pieces of a puzzle she had been too afraid to see. The first time she entered the house, she wasn't alone. There were others. The whispers had guided her, made her doubt her own thoughts. Every time she made a decision, the house reset. Every failed version of her had been absorbed into the mirrors. Sarah had not been fighting to escape. She had been fighting for her identity. The architect, "There can only be one." The mirrors shattered. And the other Sarahs stepped into reality. The final battle. Sarah screamed as the first version lunged at her. She dodged, but another grabbed her wrist. A dozen hands pulling, clawing, tearing. They were not just reflections. They were memories of failure. Each one desperate to become the real Sarah. She fought. Kicked. Scratched. Blood smeared the marble floor. And then, the red door appeared again, glowing like an open wound. The architect's voice whispered in her ear. "The architect, only one may leave." Sarah looked at the door. Then at the versions of herself. They were her. But they weren't. Her mind screamed with indecision. Then, she made the final choice. The ending. Sarah ran. She shoved past her other selves, lunging toward the red door. Hands grasped at her ankles, her arms. She reached the threshold and threw herself through. White light. Silence. Then, she was outside. The haunted house stood before her, silent, rotting. She turned, expecting to see her reflection in the windows. But there was nothing. Just emptiness. Sarah touched her face. Her skin. She was real. She had won. A single whisper drifted from the house, the voice of the architect. Are you sure? Sarah's breath caught. Her shadow on the pavement did not move. The house door creaked open behind her. And she realized she had never really left. Final shot, the camera lingers on the house. The door slams shut on its own. The screen fades to black. The end.